Hi, I am Sherlock. Welcome to my new mystery case.
It is among the oddities of my association with Mr. Sherlock Holmes that the most grotesque puzzles first announce themselves with the slightest of taps upon our sitting-room door. So it was upon a chill April morning, the fog lying low along Baker Street, and the hansoms going by as ghostly lanterns, when a timid knock preceded the entrance of a footman in sober livery, bearing the card of Lady Evelina Hartwell. The fellow's gloves trembled so violently that the pasteboard clicked against the tray. "Pray show her in," said Holmes, who had been engaged in balancing his chemical scales with a care that would have satisfied a jeweller. He did not look up until the footman had withdrawn, and a tall, veiled lady stood at the hearth. "You have come from Mayfair, madam," he remarked, "and in some haste. Your coachman is new to your service, and takes Holles Street when he should take Welbeck, an error betrayed by the splashed mud at the hem of your gown. You have not slept. The cologne upon your gloves, vervain, is of the kind ladies employ to steady themselves after a wakeful night." Our visitor's hand flew to her veil. "Mr. Holmes," she said, in a voice that strove for calm, "if half of what I have heard of you be true, you are the only man in London who can make sense of what I saw last night." Holmes inclined his head. "Dr. Watson will take your account." I drew my notebook. In the brightening grate I perceived the outline of a face, pale with strain. She lifted her veil, revealing eyes that had looked too long upon some terror. "I was hostess," she began, "to a small musicale in honour of my cousin Miss Ada Sterling at Hartwell House in Grosvenor Square. Shortly after 10 o'clock a disturbance arose at the foot of the grand stair. There stood a man, an intruder, lean, ill-clad, and with a look. Oh, Mr. Holmes, such a look! Hollow about the eyes, as if the flesh itself had shrunk away. He swayed upon his feet and seemed not to see us. He spoke only once, and the words were so strange I wrote them down at once for fear I should misremember. She passed a folded slip. Holmes, without moving from his chair, extended 2 fingers. "A pencil in violet copying ink," he observed, "from a lady's reticule. Note the faint stain on your forefinger, Lady Evelina. The words?" He opened the slip. In a delicate feminine hand was written, "The third stair breathes." "Continue," said Holmes. Before any of us could address him, he thrust out his hand as if to ward off a blow, turned upon his heel and fled. Our butler and 2 of the footmen pursued. He made for the mews and was lost in the fog. A gardener found something by the side gate, where he must have paused. "This." She produced a small object wrapped in tissue. I confess that a little thrill went through me, for the appearance of such trifles has often been the first thread in one of Holmes's astonishing tapestries. It proved to be an ivory chess pawn, a white pawn stained near the base with a smear of some dark, waxy substance. There was also in the tissue a common tram ticket, half torn, punched for the Hammersmith line. Holmes's eyes brightened for the first time. "You handled neither object?" he asked. "Only to bring them to you, Mr. Holmes." "Excellent." She hesitated. "There is more." At 11:30, while the household was in a flutter, a constable came with dreadful news. A gentleman had been found in the little lane behind our garden wall, dead. The police believe he fell or struck his head in flight. They say it is likely the same poor creature who frightened us. "You saw the body?" "No, Sir Giles Lestrade of Scotland Yard." "Inspector Lestrade," I corrected. "Inspector, yes, he would not permit it, but he showed my husband a ring from the dead man's finger. My husband is certain he has seen it on the hand of a Mr. Alistair Monckton, a clerk in the employ of Mr. Henry A. Venn, the antiquarian dealer of New Oxford Street. Mr. Monckton was known to my cousin. There was some small matter about a music folio he obtained for her. Holmes steepled his long fingers. And why, Lady Evelina, do you come to me if Scotland Yard has the matter in hand? Because the inspector is content to call it an accident, while I am certain it is not. Mr. Monckton, if indeed it is he, looked starved of sleep, not of bread. There was not a drop of rain to make the stair breathe, and yet I felt a current of cold air where there should be none. And this morning— Here her voice shook, and she steadied it with an effort. This morning, Mrs. Durning, my housekeeper, told me the third stair from the bottom of the great flight was warm to the touch. Warm, Mr. Holmes, as if a living thing lay within it. Holmes's eyes slid to the fire as if he watched there the moving figures of his thought. A warm staircase, a hollow-eyed intruder with a message, an ivory pawn with wax upon it, and half a tram ticket, he murmured. Very pretty. What of the garden lane? Inspector Lestrade said there were no marks of struggle and no robbery. The man's pockets held only a matchbook from a place called the Cyclamen Rooms, which I am told is— She faltered. A resort of opium smokers, Holmes finished dryly. And an obvious conclusion invites itself, that delirium drove the poor wretch to trespass and then to his death. Obvious conclusions are the curse of official minds. Tell me, Lady Evelina, the music last night, what was your programme? She stared, astonished. Why Chopin and Purcell? Miss Sterling performed a nocturne, and then a ground in D minor arranged from an old manuscript. Mr. Arkwright accompanied. From an old manuscript, Holmes repeated, and there was the faintest ring in his tone. And Mr. Venn's clerk procured a folio for your cousin. You see, Watson, how these little filaments cross? Confess I did not. Holmes rose at last, as if some internal balance had tilted. You did well to come. If we are to have the truth of your hollow-eyed man, we must not leave him to the charity of an inquest. You say the body is at the station? Marylebone, Mr. Holmes. Then we shall pay our respects to Inspector Lestrade. Watson, your hat. Lady Evelina, a last question. Your housekeeper is a precise woman, I infer. No servant of a different nation under her? Different nation? French, perhaps, or Italian? No, certainly not. Very good. Pray return home and do nothing. Above all, do not have the staircase pulled up until you hear from me. If anyone asks, say only that you have consulted a physician about draughts. A physician? She repeated, bewildered. Holmes tapped my arm with his cane. I mean Dr. Watson. I am calling him in a professional capacity. It will soothe the official mind. When she had gone, leaving behind a faint perfume of vervain and anxiety, Holmes placed the pawn beneath his lens. Note, Watson, the wax is not sealing wax, but beeswax tinged with ultramarine, artist's pigment. The smear is on the base only, where the piece rests. Our man has been pressing pawns into something waxen, the lid of a box perhaps, making a code or testing an impression. The tram ticket is torn on the left, which would be natural to a left-handed man. And this little black dust in the crevice, run your finger, no better, the scalpel. I did so. The speck was gritty. Cold smut? I ventured. Not coal. Emery, from a file or abrasive used to smooth metal. Now consider the inscription, the third stair breathes. A draught suggests a hollow below. Warmth suggests recent occupation. If you wished to pass a small object unseen into a house of rank, an object that might be missed upon a guest's person, but not beneath his feet, where would you hide it? In the staircase, I said, struck. Just so. Our intruder sought either to warn or to recover. The pawn tells me he was of a mind to leave a sign that the dullest housemaid could not mistake if she found it. One white pawn reversed upon the tread is a message legible across a ballroom floor. Yet he left it outside at the gate. Someone or something put him to flight before he reached the stairs. The butler? Perhaps. Or perhaps he saw what he had not expected to see. Come, we shall take the air of Marylebone and see what breathes in a dead man's pockets. After that, if Lestrade will not lend us a crowbar, I know a carpenter who will. As we descended the 18 steps from our rooms, the fog sighed along the street like a living creature. I could not put from my mind the image of a spectral figure on a marble stair, his eyes like burnt holes in paper, and beneath his feet a secret passage of warm wood and warmer intent. Holmes swung his cane with an almost jaunty air, but I have lived long enough with that gentleman to recognize in the set of his shoulders the tightening of a spring. We were upon the trail, though as yet we did not know whether it would lead us to the cyclamen rooms, to a dealer in antiquities, or to the third stair of a great house in Grosvenor Square, which by some devil's contrivance had learned to breathe. It was a short drive to the Marylebone station, and Holmes passed the time in that curious silence of his, which is not the absence of thought, but its most concentrated form. Once only he asked me to examine again the violet slip with its singular message, and once he held the pawn up to the cab window to catch what poor light the fog refracted there. "A poor lens," he murmured, "but every lens is instructive to the eye that knows how to see through it." Then he relapsed into his inward colloquy, his chin sunk upon the fold of his greatcoat, and his long fingers playing a noiseless tattoo upon the ivory head. Inspector Lestrade greeted us with his accustomed mixture of irony and relief. "So you've smelt it out already, Mr. Holmes. I had thought to send for you when the doctors had finished. A sorry case, and no call for your violin. A fall in the fog, and a broken life at the foot of a garden wall. You can put your fancy back in its case." "You have matched the body with Lady Evelina's intruder," said Holmes, ignoring the pleasantry. Lestrade lifted a shoulder. "Same build, same shabby coat, and a ring that a gentleman at the house swears belongs to one Alistair Monckton, clerk to a dealer in elderly rubbish. The pockets are a museum of nothing. Half a tram ticket, one matchbook, 6pence in coppers, and a folded slip with an address of a coffee-house near 7 Dials. Dr. Greeley says the neck went on the brick coping. Clean break, no marks of blows, no robbery. The verdict will satisfy a coroner, and if it satisfies a coroner, it is sufficient for me." "Your sufficiency is the twin of your misfortunes, Lestrade," Holmes returned with good humour. "The body?" We were led to a small room where the dead man lay upon a zinc-topped table, his face exposed to the grey light from a barred window. I am not squeamish, but there was a peculiarity about the eyelids which answered too aptly to Lady Evelina's phrase. The flesh had drawn back, so that the orbit seemed at once cavernous and painfully alert, as if the last act of life had been to widen the gaze until the lids, strained beyond nature, refused to close in death. Holmes bent low, then took from Lestrade a wash-leather and lifted the right hand. A file's kiss upon the thumb-pad, the left. He lifted it also. Stronger callus upon the first joint of the forefinger. A left-handed writer who presses hard. "You have the ring?" Lestrade produced it from a paper packet. It was of cheap gold set with a blue paste stone carved crudely with a small cyclamen flower. Holmes touched it to his tongue and made a small face. "Not paste, glass, with a smear of oil. The ring has been kept bright not by sentiment but by trade. Our man's employer dabbles in the antique. His clerk cannot afford the real. You see the cyclamen, the matchbook?" Lestrade laid it beside the ring. Holmes opened it with a pen nib from his pocket case. The inner leaves were sprinkled with the blackish dust one finds in tap-room matches. Upon the flap, a purple stamp showed a stylized flower and the legend, "The Cyclamen Rooms, Thanet Court, Soho." "A coincidence," said Lestrade. "The ring and the den, both with a flower?" Holmes's eyebrow tilted. "Coincidences are like babies, Inspector. The world is full of them, but one is seldom the exact image of another unless there is a nearer parent than chance. How came he to a Mayfair garden wall from Soho with a half-ticket to Hammersmith? If he were fleeing the law, he chose a poor direction. If he were fleeing a man, who?" "Your department," said Lestrade. "I have taken his name from the ring, and will ask at the dealer's. The inquest is tomorrow." "The name is not upon the ring," Holmes answered. "The ring is upon the name. There is a difference. Permit me one further liberty." He drew from his pocket a tiny glass phial and a wire loop. With a delicacy that would not have disgraced a surgeon, he passed the loop along the dead man's sleeve cuff and shook the speck or two he captured upon a card. "Blue grit," he said softly. "And here, upon the shirt pleat, no, Watson, your lens. Thank you. A smear of something waxen. Mr. Monckton has been in fellowship with our pawn." Lestrade shrugged. "Waxen grit are all London in miniature." "True, but London does not breathe beneath the third stair of a particular house in Grosvenor Square." "You have seen the clothing?" A sergeant brought the garments, and Holmes went through them, with the professional patience which has so often been my admiration. From an inner pocket he produced a torn paper, upon which were a hastily sketched grid of squares and the letters A to H along the upper edge, with the numbers 1 to 8 down the side. In 2 of the squares little crosses had been marked, D4 and F2. At the bottom, someone had scribbled, in a crabbed hand, "White to move, the Queen's file safe." "A chessboard diagram," I cried. "Just so," said Holmes, "and our pawn is white. Lestrade, if a man carries a chess note in his pocket and a pawn in his tissue, and he intrudes upon a house where a staircase is warm and breathing, I fear we have not yet heard his last move." "You may chase your castles, Mr. Holmes," said Lestrade, with a dryness that could not wholly conceal interest. "I shall have my verdict and my dinner. Will you come to the dealer's with me?" "In an hour. First, Watson and I have an engagement with a carpenter." The inspector laughed. "If you mean to pry up a lady's stairs, I shall require a warrant." "We mean to—" "Persuade a housekeeper," Holmes returned, and the glint in his eye warned me that he had already rehearsed the persuasion. He took the tram ticket from Lestrade's evidence tray, compared its tear with the grit on the dead man's cuff, and nodded to himself as if some minute symmetry had declared itself. We left the station in a fog so thick that the gas lamps were little more than hard yellow beads upon a string of grey. Holmes walked swiftly, and I kept pace, my mind full of the dead man's strained eyelids and of that queer little diagram with its marked squares. "You attach great weight to the wax?" I asked. "To the wax and to the warmth. If the third stair be hollow for a purpose, it must be either to conceal or to convey. Concealment is the older art, conveyance the more modern. Now what is conveyed by a hollow stair in a house that entertains a music hall from an old manuscript is visited by a clerk from an antiquarian, and is the goal, in extremis, of a man whose eyes have looked too long upon the inside of some hellish dream." "Opium?" I suggested. "Ah, Watson, if opium were the answer, the staircase would grow cold by noon. No, there is something that must be kept warm, warm as a living thing, Our Lady said, and yet hidden. A volatile oil, a chemical bath, a metal worked by heat from below, or—" He broke off. "We shall see." Hartwell House received us with that chilly grandeur which great London houses affect when they feel themselves too well bred for curiosity. Mrs. Durning, the housekeeper, a spare woman with iron-grey hair, and a mouth that could have cut pastry without a knife, stood guard at the foot of the great stair. Holmes bowed as if to a duchess. "Madam," said he, "I am here in the guise of a physician and a friend. My colleague will recommend something for your draughts. For myself, I desire nothing more impertinent than a strip of carpet and a box of nails. In return, I promise to remove an inconvenience which, if not remedied, will be the ruin of your wax." "My wax, sir?" she repeated, stiff as a poker. "The wax you polish your treads with," said Holmes. "It cakes in the join, chokes the breath, and breeds dry rot. Pray may I lift the third stair from the bottom for a moment? I shall replace it so neatly that even your eye will forgive me." Her severity wavered at the appeal to her pride. "If her ladyship has consented—" "She has," said Holmes smoothly, "and I have her authority to hold you blameless for any necessary hammering." In the end, a bribe to the household dignity was not required. Holmes, with the assistance of a footman and a borrowed pry, worked deftly at the brass-headed nails that held the stair-runner. The strip came back, the tread lifted an inch, then two. A gust of air, faint, yet unmistakably warmer than the room, breathed upon my face. Holmes's eyes flashed. "There is our fire's whisper," he said. "Gently now, Watson, your hand beneath. Feel that?" It was a wooden box, snugly fitted into the cavity where the riser met the stringer. The top was drilled with minute holes. From within there came a soft, almost imperceptible purr, like the murmur of a sleeping cat. Holmes's nostrils dilated. "Not a flame," he murmured. "A clockwork. And hush, do you hear it? The faintest clink, as of glass against glass. Our hollow-eyed man did not speak in riddles, Watson. The stair does breathe. The question now is, what is it breathing for?" Holmes leaned closer to the cavity, his keen eyes glittering in the lamplight that spilled from the sconces above the staircase. The faint ticking sound deepened to a soft rhythmic hum, as if the box itself were alive, breathing through those needle-sized holes. "Extraordinary," he murmured, his hand hovering just above the wood. "Do you perceive the warmth, Watson? This is no simple hiding place. It's a mechanism, still active." I felt it too, a pulse of heat as steady as the beat of a heart. "Careful," I whispered, but Holmes had already drawn a thin blade from his pocket and slipped it beneath the edge of the box. There was a subtle click, and the panel loosened with a sigh of air. A faint odour escaped, metallic, faintly sweet, and vaguely chemical. Holmes inhaled sharply. "Ether and perhaps camphor," he said. "We are in the province of science, not sorcery." He lifted the lid. Inside, cushioned in dark felt, lay a small glass retort wrapped in paper soaked with oil. Coiled tubes ran from it into a tiny brass cylinder that ticked softly, its gears faintly vibrating. Around the apparatus were bits of wax, a coil of copper wire, and, to my astonishment, several miniature chess pieces, 5 pawns and a single knight, all white, each bearing traces of the same blue wax as the one Lady Evelina had brought. "What on earth is this contrivance?" I asked, struggling to contain my curiosity. Holmes did not reply immediately. He bent close, his sharp nose nearly touching the brass cylinder, and listened. "A slow-acting heat source, regulated by clockwork," he murmured. "The ether generates a gentle warmth to preserve something volatile, or perhaps to trigger a chemical reaction at precise intervals. Observe this copper wire. It leads downward, under the stair. The mechanism breathes, Watson, because it exhales its heat. The dead man, our hollow-eyed messenger, knew of its existence, and his cryptic warning, 'The third stair breathes,' was no metaphor. Before I could frame my next question, Holmes replaced the lid and turned to Mrs. Durning, who stood clutching her apron, white-faced. "Madam, has anyone been tampering with this staircase recently? Repairing, polishing, or laying new carpet?" She hesitated. "Only last month, sir. A carpenter from Mr. Venn's shop came to fix a loose tread. My lady said he was recommended by her cousin, Miss Sterling. I watched him at it, but he said, 'It was delicate work. Wouldn't have me too near.'" Holmes's eyes flickered. "Mr. Venn's carpenter, recommended by Miss Sterling. How convenient. Did this man leave a name?" "I believe it was Monckton, sir. Mr. Alistair Monckton." Holmes and I exchanged a glance. "Our dead clerk," he said softly, "and the loop tightens." He knelt again, tracing the copper wire that vanished between the stairs. This mechanism was his doing, but for whom was it done? To what end? There is intelligence here, and secrecy, both rarely in harmony unless some crime binds them. He looked up sharply. "Watson, fetch my glass and knife. We shall follow this thread to its conclusion." Working with the precision of a surgeon, Holmes eased up the wooden riser below the box. The wire descended into a hollow space that extended toward the back of the house. After several minutes of delicate probing, he drew out the end of the wire, which terminated in a small tin capsule, no larger than a coin purse. He opened it carefully. Inside lay a roll of photographic film, tightly wound and bound with a strip of black ribbon. On the edge of the film were faint impressions, tiny letters written in mirror script. Holmes angled the film toward the lamplight. "Letters reversed," he said. "This is not ordinary photography, it is micrography. Someone has reduced a document to a scale invisible to the naked eye. These glass tubes, the warmth, the ether, all designed to preserve the film from humidity. Ingenious, Watson! We have stumbled upon a miniature archive concealed beneath Lady Evelina's stairs." "But what document could be of such importance?" I asked. "Surely not merely a curiosity of science?" "Not curiosity, commerce," said Holmes. "The antiquarian Venn deals in manuscripts and rare folios. Suppose one of these contained a secret, an unpublished work, a cipher, a formula, something worth far more than paper and ink. The mechanism would allow a man to smuggle such microfilms unseen into the home of a titled family, perhaps to sell or copy them later. Monckton may have been the courier, yet the nature of his warning suggests a change of heart, or the fear of discovery." He sealed the capsule again and replaced it. "We shall not alarm Lady Evelina yet. It is clear that Monckton intended to retrieve this device last night. Someone prevented him, fatally. Therefore the person who killed him knew of its existence. The next step is plain. We must visit Mr. Henry A. Venn." We left the house under cover of dusk. Holmes was restless, walking with long strides and his chin thrust forward, his coat-tails flicking at his heels. "There is a pattern forming, Watson," he said as we turned into Oxford Street. "Lady Evelina's cousin brings a folio from Venn's shop. A clerk from the same establishment installs a secret device beneath her staircase, and a night later that clerk is found dead. You recall the chessboard sketch. In his pocket? 2 squares marked D4 and F2, positions of attack and retreat. Monckton was signalling something. The pawn we found corresponds to D4 and the knight to F2, a move of warning perhaps, or a code shared between conspirators. Venn's shop, when we reached it, was shuttered, though a thin line of light escaped through the curtains of an upper window. Holmes rapped thrice with his stick. A thin, ferret-faced man in spectacles peered out. "We are closed," he said. "Then open for Mr. Sherlock Holmes," said my companion, producing his card. The man's face paled, and the door unlatched immediately. The interior was a labyrinth of shelves crowded with manuscripts, scrolls, and framed prints. The air smelled of dust, glue, and ancient paper. Venn himself appeared from behind a curtain, his manner obsequious, yet uneasy. "Mr. Holmes, what an unexpected honour. You come about poor Monckton, I presume? A tragedy? The Yard was here not 2 hours ago." Holmes regarded him keenly. "Then you know of his death. I am interested in his work here, the restoration of certain folios, perhaps." Yes, he was a skilled hand," said Venn too quickly. "Clean, meticulous, no better clerk in London." "Indeed, and yet he found time to repair staircases in Mayfair." The antiquarian's composure faltered. "Ah, Lady Evelina Hartwell, yes, that was a private commission, a favour, really, for her cousin Miss Sterling, who has been a valued patron. A step had warped, nothing more." Holmes's tone was mild. "Then you will have no objection to my examining his workbench." Venn hesitated, then gestured toward the back. "By all means." The workbench was neatly arranged, every tool aligned with military precision, but amid the brushes and cutting blades lay a smear of blue wax, identical to that on the pawn. Holmes's thin smile appeared. "The same hand, the same material. Tell me, Mr. Venn, do you sell optical devices, lenses, for instance, small enough to fit within a coin capsule?" The antiquarian blinked rapidly. "Some, perhaps, collector's curiosities." "Curious indeed," said Holmes softly. "You see, I have just come from Lady Evelina's house, where one of your employees' repairs contained a heat-regulated device designed to protect micrographic film, a device that Monckton apparently tried to recover before someone silenced him. If you wish to avoid the scandal of a public inquiry, you will tell me now what those films contain." For a long moment, the man said nothing. Then his hands trembled, and he removed his spectacles. "It was not my doing," he said hoarsely. "Monckton acted on another's orders. A collector, foreign I think, paid handsomely for copies of private manuscripts from noble families. Monckton smuggled them out in that infernal contraption. I swear I never touched the films myself." "Name the collector," said Holmes sharply. "I do not know it, only that—"
Letters came from the Cyclamen Rooms, Thanet Court, a flower as signature. Holmes's eyes hardened. The Cyclamen once more, then it is there our trail leads next. As we stepped back into the foggy night, Holmes turned up his collar and said quietly, "We are close now, Watson. The hollow-eyed man was not the architect of this plot. He was its conscience. And men who grow a conscience amidst crime seldom live long enough to explain it." The fog had thickened into a dense, amber murk that wrapped itself around the gas lamps like gauze as we left Oxford Street behind. The wheels of the cab made a whispering sound through the damp, and the air smelled faintly of wet soot and stale beer from the taverns that clustered near Soho. Holmes sat beside me in silence, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, his sharp profile etched against the dim glow of the carriage lamp. "The Cyclamen Rooms," he said at last. "A name chosen for a flower that thrives in shadow and poison. Fitting, don't you think, Watson? We shall find our roots there." I had heard of the place only in whispers, a disreputable establishment where the dregs of London society mingled with those of rank who preferred their vices masked. Yet Holmes seemed entirely at ease as the cab drew up before a narrow archway in Thanet Court. A red lantern burned dimly above the entrance, its glass etched with the same stylized flower we had seen on Monckton's ring. Two men lounged by the door, their eyes dull with smoke. Holmes brushed past them as if they were ornaments. Inside, a stair descended steeply into a room heavy with fumes of opium and burning sandalwood. The low murmur of conversation, broken by the occasional clink of a glass, wove through the haze like the whisper of wind through reeds. Holmes moved lightly among the couches, his expression one of detached curiosity. "We are hunting minds, not bodies tonight," he said softly. "Observe, Watson, the arrangement of the tables, the curtains between alcoves, the habit of secrecy even in pleasure. The man who runs such a den is no common criminal. He is a conductor orchestrating a symphony of concealment." A waiter approached, his eyes quick and calculating. "Private room, gentlemen?" he said. Holmes nodded, pressing a coin into his palm. "The one with the flower carved upon the lintel?" The man hesitated, but led us through a narrow corridor to a small chamber lit by a single hanging lamp. Upon the wall, faint but unmistakable, was the cyclamen emblem drawn in chalk. Holmes closed the door softly behind us. "This, Watson, is where Monckton's letters came from. Let us see what remains." The room was sparsely furnished, a low table, a couch, and a writing desk pushed against the wall. On it lay a stack of envelopes, each sealed with the same purple wax that marked the pawn. Holmes's face tightened with satisfaction. "We are among friends," he murmured. He broke one seal delicately,
revealing a letter in an elegant but foreign hand. "To our correspondent in London," he read aloud. "The films must be conveyed at once to the recipient. The warmth must not falter, or the substance will crystallize and perish. Payment will follow upon proof of receipt." He looked up. "The warmth again, Watson. Whatever these films preserved was unstable. Perhaps a chemical formula, perhaps something living." He turned another letter, then a third. "Ah, here, a signature, stylized, no name, only an initial, C." He paused. "C may stand for cyclamen, or for the one who hides behind it." At that moment, the faint creak of a floorboard reached our ears. Holmes motioned for silence, his gaze fixed on the narrow curtain that concealed the adjoining corridor. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the curtain stirred. In one swift motion, Holmes was there, pulling it aside. A man stumbled forward, thin and nervous, his eyes glinting with guilt. Holmes caught him by the collar before he could flee. "And who, pray, are you?" the man stammered. I clean the rooms, sir. I swear it." Holmes's gaze was icy. "Then your cleaning is thorough indeed, for your fingers bear traces of violet wax. Speak quickly, who sends the letters from this room?" "I don't know names," the man gasped. "They come at night, 2 of them, a tall one with a scar, and another who wears dark spectacles. The letters go in boxes to the post in Soho. I only keep the place ready, sir. Please." "Where do these men stay?" "At the lodging house on Greek Street, number 7, the one with the red shutters." Holmes released him abruptly. "You may go, but should you mention our visit to anyone, I will ensure that Lestrade's men keep you company for a month." The fellow vanished with astonishing speed. Holmes turned to me, his face alight with quiet triumph. "Greek Street, Watson. Our scarred man and his partner are the next pieces on the board. The pawn was Monckton, the knight his conscience, and now we must find the kings who played them." Within 20 minutes we stood before number 7. The house was tall and narrow, its upper windows shuttered, the paint on its door flaking like old parchment. Holmes rapped lightly, and when no answer came, he bent to the lock, producing a thin sliver of steel. The door yielded without a sound. Inside, the air was close and foul. We ascended the narrow stair, each creak echoing in the gloom. On the second floor, a dim light filtered beneath a door. Holmes motioned for caution, then pushed it open a fraction. 2 men sat within, one tall and gaunt, with a scar that dragged his lip into a permanent sneer, the other short, spectacled, and stooped over a small lamp. Between them lay a wooden box, identical to the one hidden beneath Lady Evelina's staircase. I caught my breath. Holmes studied the scene for several seconds, then stepped boldly inside. "Good evening, gentlemen," he said. In that cool, precise tone I had learned to dread for others' sake. "You are at work, I perceive, though not perhaps in a trade you would advertise. I am Sherlock Holmes, and this is Dr. Watson. You will oblige me by remaining seated." The scarred man sprang up, a pistol flashing from his coat. Holmes moved with incredible speed, striking the man's wrist with his cane. The weapon clattered to the floor, and I kicked it aside. The man with the spectacles made a dash for the window, but Holmes caught him by the collar and thrust him back into his chair. "Now then," he said quietly, "you may speak or you may hang. Which do you prefer?" The man with the scar spat. "We've done nothing the law can touch." "Perhaps," said Holmes, "but the law may be more elastic than you think. You corresponded with a man named Monckton, who lies dead. You installed devices under the staircases of several houses, one of which conceals micrographic films. Those films contain material dangerous enough that you kill to protect them. Who gives you your orders?" Silence. Then the spectacled man muttered, "We take them from a gentleman called Cyril Harrow. He brings the designs, says they're to be copied for the continent. We don't ask questions." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Cyril Harrow, at last, a name." The man nodded. "He's no common thief. He comes from the best houses, talks like a lord, always says the world will thank him one day." Holmes released his grip and stood. "Thank him indeed," he murmured. "Watson, we have our king. Now we must learn his game." We left the two bound and silent for the police to collect. Outside, the fog had lifted slightly, and the first hint of dawn glimmered faintly along the rooftops. Holmes stood for a long moment, his face unreadable in the pale light. "Cyril Harrow," he said again, as though testing the weight of the name. "He moves behind the curtains of London's drawing rooms, stealing not gold, but knowledge. And Monckton's death was his pawn sacrifice. The board is set, Watson. The next move is ours." The pale light of dawn had barely reached the upper windows of Baker Street when Holmes threw himself into his chair, the folds of his greatcoat sweeping the floor like the wings of some restless bird. The fire was unlit, the air sharp, yet he seemed insensible to cold or weariness. He sat motionless for a time, his fingers pressed together, and his eyes fixed upon the carpet, where the first thin rays of morning made shifting patterns upon the worn threads. "Watson," he said at length, "do you recall the expression upon the face of the man with the scar when I mentioned Monckton's name?" "I do," I replied. It was as if he heard his own sentence pronounced. "Precisely," said Holmes. "The guilty conscience does not recoil from the crime. It recoils from the memory of the man who sought to expose it. Monckton's warning was not directed at Lady Evelina. It was meant for Harrow. The phrase, 'the third stair breathes,' was a signal, a code of defiance. Monckton discovered something in the films, something his master did not wish revealed. I poured him a cup of coffee, which he accepted absently. "Then this Cyril Harrow," I ventured, "is the true architect of the scheme. But what does he seek to gain? The films, the chemical warmth, the secrecy. Surely these are instruments of espionage rather than burglary." A flicker of approval crossed Holmes's face. "Your instincts serve you well, my dear fellow. Espionage indeed, but not the crude sort of stolen dispatches or pilfered naval charts. Consider the delicacy of the mechanism, the refinement of its purpose. Monckton was no common thief. He was a craftsman, one who understood the danger of his own handiwork. He may have believed himself employed in duplicating ancient texts, but the films concealed a different kind of manuscript, a formula, I suspect, or a ciphered record of some experimental process. The ether, the heat, the wax, all designed to preserve something unstable until delivery. He rose suddenly and began to pace the room. "Cyril Harrow," he muttered. "An educated man, confident, moving freely among the gentry, a dealer in knowledge. We must discover where such a man conceals his operations." The cyclamen rooms were his post, not his home. He halted by the window, his lean silhouette framed against the thinning fog. "There is one who may know him, Miss Ada Sterling. You will recall that she introduced Monckton to Lady Evelina, and that she, too, has dealings with Venn's shop. If Harrow's intrigues reach into her circle, she may have seen him, though perhaps without realizing who he was." I followed his thought at once. "Then we should call upon her without delay." "Excellent," said Holmes. "You shall be my conscience in the matter, Watson. A lady's reserve yields more easily to your courtesy than to my curiosity. I shall content myself with observing." By noon we stood once more in the drawing-room of Hartwell House. Miss Ada Sterling, a young woman of musical refinement and fragile health, greeted us with visible nervousness. Her eyes, though clear, betrayed sleeplessness, and her hands trembled slightly as she motioned us to sit. Holmes's gaze rested upon her as a hawk's might upon a dove. "I am sorry to intrude again upon your household, Miss Sterling," said Holmes with grave politeness, "but I must ask you to assist us in clarifying a matter concerning Mr. Alistair Monckton." At the mention of the name, her composure faltered. "Mr. Monckton?" she repeated faintly. "Is it true, what the newspapers say, that he is dead?" "It is unhappily true," said Holmes. "We believe he came here the night before his death to prevent a crime. May I ask how you first made his acquaintance?" She hesitated, then spoke quickly, as though eager to unburden herself. "It was through Mr. Venn. I am fond of old music, and I often visited his shop to examine manuscripts. Mr. Monckton was always obliging, so intelligent, so earnest. A few weeks ago he brought me a folio of Purcell's works, beautifully copied, but afterwards he seemed troubled, haunted almost. He begged me not to show the folio to anyone and said it contained something dangerous. I thought it only his imagination." Holmes inclined his head slightly. "Dangerous, you say? Did he ever mention another name? Cyril Harrow, perhaps?" She looked startled. "Yes, how extraordinary. He spoke of Mr. Harrow only once, in such a way that I thought him delirious. He said, 'If Harrow learns the secret, London will burn.' I tried to calm him, but he only laughed and said he would make certain the secret never reached him." "Did he tell you what the secret was?" "No, only that it was hidden in the music, within the notation itself. He said the symbols carried another meaning, one only a trained eye could discern." Holmes's expression sharpened. "Clever indeed, a cipher within a composition. Notes that spell a message to those who can read beyond sound. Where is this folio now?" She rose and crossed to the piano, where a bundle of sheet music lay. Her hand trembled as she drew out a slim volume bound in pale leather. Holmes received it as reverently as a priest might handle a relic. He opened it, studying the notes, his eyes flicking from line to line. Then he uttered a soft exclamation. "See here, Watson. The key signatures shift irregularly, and certain notes are dotted with minute blue stains visible only in slanting light, the same ultramarine pigment as the wax upon the pawn. This is no accident. Each mark corresponds to a letter in a simple transposition cipher. Monckton hid his message in the very score." He turned the pages swiftly, his pencil moving with precise economy. The message reads, "The formula burns, Harrow betrayed, the stair breathes fire." He looked up, his eyes gleaming with fierce intelligence. "Watson, this is no mere poetic flourish. Monckton discovered that the mechanism beneath Lady Evelina's stairs is more than a warming device. It is an incendiary one. A chemical charge lies hidden there, perhaps volatile enough to destroy the entire house. Monckton tried to retrieve it, but Harrow's men silenced him first. Miss Sterling gasped, her hand to her mouth. "Then Lady Evelina is in danger even now." Holmes snapped the folio shut. "Not if we act swiftly. Watson, we must have a hansom at once." Within 15 minutes we were again before the great house in Grosvenor Square. The footman admitted us in alarm, for Holmes's urgency left no room for explanation. "Send no word to her ladyship," he ordered. "Only clear the household from the lower floors." We mounted the grand staircase, the echo of our steps striking hollow against the marble. Holmes knelt beside the third stair, his fingers feeling along the join. "As I feared," he said, "the box we replaced last night has been tampered with. The clockwork hum is gone. Listen." I bent close, and in the stillness I heard a faint, sinister hiss, the whisper of gas escaping through metal. Holmes's face hardened. "The ether has turned volatile. Monckton's device has been converted into a bomb." "Good heavens, Holmes," I cried. "Can we defuse it?" He drew his penknife and a length of wire from his pocket. "We shall attempt it. If I fail, Watson, kindly stand clear of the stair. I have always preferred to leave the world on a note of usefulness rather than accident." He worked rapidly, hands steady, lips compressed. The hiss grew louder, then ceased. There was a click, a puff of acrid smoke, and the mechanism went still. Holmes straightened, his face pale but calm. "Safe," he said quietly. "The breath of the stair is gone." I exhaled the air I had not known I was holding. "Holmes, you have saved them all." He gave a faint, tired smile. "For the moment, yes. But this was only the instrument. The mind that designed it is still at large. And I fear, Watson, that when we find Cyril Harrow we shall look upon a man who believes himself not a criminal, but a visionary." Holmes stood motionless upon the landing for several moments. After disabling the device, his head bowed and his expression unreadable. The faint curl of smoke drifted up from the crevice beneath the stair, carrying with it a trace of burnt ether. "We were minutes away from catastrophe," he murmured at last. "Had the timer run its course, the explosion would have consumed half this house, and the secret with it. Monckton's conscience bought these people their lives." He turned away abruptly, his eyes distant. "Watson, you see now the shape of Harrow's mind. He deals in destruction, not for gain, but for belief. He imagines himself an architect of renewal through ruin." Before I could speak, Lady Evelina appeared at the head of the stairs, pale and trembling. "Mr. Holmes, what has happened? Mrs. Durning said you came to inspect the draft. Why does the air smell of smoke?" Holmes descended to meet her, his manner composed but grave. "You may be thankful, madam, that the draft has been remedied. The mechanism hidden in your staircase was designed to ignite a chemical charge. It has now been rendered harmless." She swayed and caught the banister for support. "A bomb? In my house?" "Installed by your carpenter, under false pretenses," Holmes replied gently. "But fear nothing more. The danger has passed. I would advise discretion, Lady Evelina. The less said to the press, the safer all concerned will be. There are greater forces behind this than we yet understand." When we had taken our leave, Holmes spoke little, until we were seated once again in a cab bound for Baker Street. The rain had begun to fall, and the streets glistened beneath the lamplight, the reflections of passing carriages weaving like restless ghosts. "Watson," he said at last, "Cyril Harrow has shown his hand. Monckton's death, the hidden mechanism, the coded music, Each points to a plan of calculated grandeur. He is no mere anarchist. He is a chemist, an inventor, and a zealot. And I would wager the formula Monckton sought to destroy was Harrow's own creation, one capable of combustion so refined that a few ounces could raise a building without trace of powder or fuse. I shuddered. A weapon, then? Precisely. And one disguised as art, a melody whose notes conceal a scientific method. Monckton recognized the horror he had helped build. His message to Lady Evelina was not a warning to her alone. It was a challenge to Harrow himself, a declaration that the pawn would no longer move at his command. Holmes's eyes gleamed in the dim light. And what does the chess player do when a pawn rebels, Watson? He removes it from the board, I said quietly. Exactly. Monckton's death was inevitable the moment he defied his master, yet he contrived, in dying, to leave the clue we needed. The question now is, where does Harrow make his next move? As we entered our rooms at Baker Street, Mrs. Hudson looked up in alarm at the sight of our soot-streaked faces. Holmes dismissed her concern with a wave of the hand and strode straight to his writing desk. He opened a drawer, took out his index of names, and ran his finger rapidly along the cards. Harrow, Cyril Harrow, he muttered. There, former lecturer in experimental chemistry at St. Jude's College, Cambridge. Dismissed 6 years ago after an explosion destroyed part of the laboratory. Later associated with various industrial firms under assumed names. Rumoured to have joined a society devoted to progress through energy transformation. He looked up, his expression tightening. Energy transformation, Watson, do you see? The same phrase Monckton used in his notes to describe the reaction within the ether compound. Harrow has been perfecting his formula under the guise of scientific advancement. Then we must warn the authorities, I exclaimed. Holmes shook his head. Not yet. Lestrade would see only a madman with chemicals, while Harrow moves among the drawing rooms of the learned as a visionary. To act too soon would drive him underground. We must catch him at work, in the act of turning his theory into terror. He reached for his violin and drew the bow across the strings, producing a single, thin note that quivered in the air like a thread of glass. He will not stop, Watson. A man who has devoted his life to such an invention cannot bear to see it lost. He will seek another means to prove its power, another stage upon which to display his brilliance. The next device will not lie hidden beneath a staircase. It will strike where spectacle is greatest. I stared at him. Then where? Holmes lowered the violin slowly. Where intellect and society meet in perfect vanity, the Royal Institute perhaps, or the Winter Exhibition at the Academy, he will crave an audience worthy of his discovery. He will burn for applause, quite literally. We spent the next hours in feverish activity. Holmes dispatched telegrams to his contacts in the Yard and in scientific circles, requesting any word of Harrow's recent movements. Shortly before dusk, a reply arrived from Inspector Lestrade. Holmes tore it open and read aloud. Harrow, seen at Westminster Bridge last night in company of foreign gentlemen. Proceeded east by cab, destination unknown. Strong smell of ether, reported at scene. Holmes folded the paper. He tests his materials in the open air now. Dangerous, but effective. That smell would betray him anywhere. Watson, the time has come to visit St. Jude's College. A man cannot wholly erase the past, and his old laboratory may yield what his new one conceals. We took the evening train to Cambridge. The damp fields streamed by in the fading light, and Holmes sat with his arms folded, his gaze fixed on nothing. When we arrived, the porter at St. Jude's received us with some surprise, but led us willingly enough to the disused wing of the college. The corridor was cold and echoing, the walls blackened where fire had once licked the plaster. Holmes's lamp threw wavering shadows as he examined the benches and shelves now thick with dust. "Here," he said suddenly, pointing to a scorch mark on the wall. "You see how it radiates outward in a perfect circle? That was no careless explosion. It was controlled, confined. The man was testing precision, not luck." He moved to a broken cabinet and pried open a drawer. Inside lay a set of small glass phials, their contents crystallized to a pale blue powder. "The residue of his compound. Smell it, Watson. Carefully." I obeyed, recoiling at once. Ether, again. Ether, yes, but mixed with nitrocellulose vapor and potassium salts. This was the embryo of his later device. He has perfected it since. Observe these sketches, diagrams of coiled tubing identical to the mechanism beneath the staircase. Holmes pocketed the papers. "This proves his continuity. The man who destroyed his college laboratory has refined the same principle into a weapon of terrifying subtlety." The sound of a footstep behind us made me start. Holmes extinguished the lamp instantly, and we stood in darkness. Then faintly, through the broken door, came the sound of breathing, slow, deliberate. A match flared, and for an instant we saw a pale face framed by the yellow glow, eyes burning with fanatic intensity. "Gentlemen," said a cold, clear voice, "you trespass upon sacred ground." "Cyril Harrow," whispered Holmes. The man smiled faintly. "You know my name, then? Good. It saves introductions. You have seen the ashes of my failure. Would you care to see a spark of my triumph?" He raised a small metal sphere, its surface glimmering with a faint blue light. Holmes took a single step forward, his voice low and measured. "If that is your triumph, Mr. Harrow, it will burn the world that applauds you. Think carefully before you strike the match." The smile deepened. "On the contrary, Mr. Holmes," he said softly, "the match was struck long ago." The faint blue glow from Harrow's device pulsed softly in the darkness, like the heart of some living creature. Holmes stood perfectly still, every nerve drawn taut, his face illuminated only by the flickering light from the sphere. I felt my breath catch as I watched the man before us, tall, gaunt, with a terrible calm in his expression, the serenity of one who believes himself untouchable. The scent of ether hung in the air, mingled with the sharp tang of burnt metal. "You speak of ashes," Holmes said quietly, his voice cutting through the stillness. "But I see only the embers of your madness. You've murdered a man who trusted you and nearly destroyed an innocent house. For what? To prove that your vanity could outshine your reason?" Harrow's pale eyes gleamed like glass. "You mistake me, Mr. Holmes. My work is not vanity, it is evolution. What you call destruction, I call purification. The world decays in its comfort. I would bring it a new dawn, powered by the very breath of creation." Holmes's tone hardened. "And how many must die for your dawn to break?" Harrow smiled faintly. "Do you count deaths, Mr. Holmes, when they come in war? Do you weigh the corpses on one side and call it progress? I offer a cleaner flame, a single thought that can erase the filth of empires." He raised the sphere slightly, and the faint hum within it intensified. "Careful!" I cried, taking an involuntary step forward, but Holmes motioned me back without looking away from the man. "You have chosen the wrong stage for your revelation, Harrow," he said. "You stand in the ruins of your own disgrace. You failed once here. You will fail again." For a heartbeat, the two men regarded each other, predator and hunter locked in silence. Then Holmes spoke again, softly, dangerously. "The composition of your device is imperfect. You've refined the heat, but not the balance. You're using ether as your stabilizer, yes, but without an inhibitor, it will turn volatile in less than 10 seconds once exposed to air. Set it down, or you'll destroy yourself along with us." Harrow's hand trembled just slightly, and I knew Holmes had struck a nerve. "You lie," the man said, though his voice lacked conviction. Holmes's lips curved faintly. "Do I? The very sphere you hold is sweating condensation even now. See the droplets forming at the joint? That's not moisture, Harrow. It's the compound breaking down. You've minutes, perhaps seconds, before it ignites spontaneously." The fanatic's eyes darted to the sphere. His knuckles whitened. "Impossible," he whispered. Holmes moved forward a single step, every motion controlled, deliberate. "Set it down, and I'll show you how to contain it. Prove you're the genius you claim to be, or prove you're nothing but a pyromaniac philosopher." For an instant the spell seemed to break. Harrow's gaze wavered, torn between doubt and pride. Then abruptly the blue light flared brighter, and his expression changed from defiance to sudden fear. "It's unstable," he breathed. The seal, Holmes, lunged. In a blur, he seized the man's wrist, wrenching the sphere free and hurling it toward the open window. There was a blinding flash and a deep, muffled roar. The glass shattered outward, and a rush of heat swept through the room. I staggered back as the flames licked the edges of the sill, then died almost at once, leaving behind a trail of acrid smoke and sparks falling into the darkness below. Holmes stood by the window, motionless, his face turned away from the glare. "You see, Harrow," he said softly, "the breath of creation burns its creator first." Harrow collapsed to his knees, staring in disbelief at the ruined remains of his invention. "You've ruined it," he whispered hoarsely. "Years of work, gone." Holmes turned sharply. "Years of murder, you mean? Monckton was right to defy you. He understood the cost of your perfection." The man looked up, his features twisted by a strange mixture of fury and sorrow. He was weak. He would have betrayed us all to those who cannot see. You call it murder, I call it mercy. "Mercy?" Holmes repeated, his eyes flashing. "You built a machine to turn homes into furnaces. You sent your disciples into drawing rooms to hide bombs beneath the feet of families. There is no mercy in that, only megalomania." I saw Holmes's hand tighten around the hilt of his cane, yet he kept his voice calm. "You will come with us, Harrow. Scotland Yard will decide the measure of your genius." But Harrow's composure, shattered for a moment, returned with frightening swiftness. "I think not, Mr. Holmes," he said coldly. With a sudden movement, he drew a small revolver from his pocket and levelled it at Holmes's chest. "The world will not understand what I have built, but one day they will. You cannot stop an idea by killing its prophet." Holmes did not move. His gaze was steady, his tone almost conversational. "Perhaps not, but I can ensure the prophet stands trial before he ascends to martyrdom." Before Harrow could reply, a shout echoed from the corridor outside, followed by the pounding of boots. Lestrade burst through the doorway with 2 constables at his heels, their pistols drawn. "Drop it, Harrow!" he barked. "You're surrounded." The chemist's eyes darted from Holmes to the policeman, and for a moment I thought he might fire. Then, with a sigh that was almost weary, he lowered the revolver and let it clatter to the floor. The tension drained from the room like breath from a dying man. Lestrade stepped forward, seizing the prisoner by the arm. "We've been tracking this lunatic since your telegram, Holmes. You've timed it to the minute." Holmes gave a faint, ironic bow. "My compliments to Scotland Yard for its punctuality." Harrow allowed himself to be led away, but as he passed Holmes, he turned his head and spoke in a low voice that chilled me to the bone. "You may stop the fire, Holmes," he said, "but you cannot stop the idea. There are others who believe as I do. When next you see the sky glow, remember my name." Holmes said nothing. He watched silently as they dragged the man down the corridor and into the night. For a long while we stood in the shattered room, the faint dawnlight creeping through the broken window. At last, Holmes spoke, his voice weary but steady. "It is the curse of the age, Watson, the brilliance that breeds its own destruction. Harrow would have set London alight merely to see how brightly it burned." I looked at him, troubled. And yet, in another time, with another heart, he might have been celebrated as a genius. Holmes smiled faintly. Many criminals share that distinction. The line between discovery and disaster, my dear fellow, is as thin as a glass vial, and tonight we nearly watched it break. He turned toward the window, the wind stirring his hair, and for a moment I thought I saw a shadow of something almost human in his expression. Not triumph, but a weary melancholy. "Come, Watson," he said quietly. "The dawn has broken. Let us leave the ghosts of science to rest in peace." We left the ruined laboratory as the first rays of morning touched the spires of Cambridge, and though Holmes spoke no more during the journey home, I knew that within him the fire of that night still burned, a flame of intellect that, unlike Harrow's, illuminated rather than destroyed. The morning train carried us back to London beneath a sky the colour of tarnished steel. Holmes sat opposite me, motionless, his face pale and drawn, his eyes half closed as though he contemplated some grim inner arithmetic. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels might have lulled another man into silence, but I had known Holmes too long to mistake his stillness for repose. His mind was awake and in full pursuit, though the quarry had been taken. When at last I ventured to speak, it was only to voice the question that had troubled me since Harrow's arrest. "You believe his talk of others, Holmes, that he was part of a larger circle?" Holmes opened his eyes, their grey depths sharp and remote. "A circle, perhaps not in the common sense, but in the intellectual one," he said slowly. "Harrow's delusion was born not of solitude, but of fellowship. The Cyclamen rooms, Venn's antiquarian shop, Monckton's microfilms, all the work of minds conversant in science, philosophy, and art. Such enterprises breed followers, even disciples. There will be others who shared his doctrine of creative annihilation." I frowned. "Then you think his capture is not the end?" Holmes gave a faint, mirthless smile. "An end, certainly, but perhaps only to one act of a longer tragedy. The idea that knowledge must destroy in order to progress, it appeals to a certain kind of brilliance untempered by conscience." Harrow was the flame. There will be those who wish to keep the embers alive. We reached Baker Street just as the lamps were being extinguished. Mrs. Hudson, having read the morning papers, greeted us with relief that turned to alarm at the sight of Holmes's soot-streaked coat. He waved her off impatiently, tossing his hat upon the table. "No telegrams?" "Two, sir, both marked urgent." He tore the first open, scanned it, and tossed it aside. "From Lestrade. Harrow has been placed under guard at the Tower Infirmary. He refuses to speak, takes no food, and has written a dozen pages of incoherent notes upon scraps of newspaper." He opened the second and froze. I watched a change pass across his features. First curiosity, then disbelief, and finally a terrible, measured calm. "Watson," he said quietly, "we are not finished. Read this." The telegram bore the seal of Scotland Yard. "Explosion at Thanet Court. Cyclamen rooms destroyed. 3 dead. Cause unknown. Ether fumes suspected. Police investigating possible connection to Harrow case." Holmes folded the paper carefully, his long fingers trembling ever so slightly. "The cyclamen burns," he murmured. "The blossom consumes its own stem. Harrow's warning was not prophecy, but instruction. Someone has carried out his unfinished work. Before I could reply, he was already at his desk, consulting maps, directories, and notebooks. "We must return to Thanet Court at once. The yard will see only another accident of chemistry, but we shall read the handwriting behind the flame." The cab carried us through the dreary morning, fog curling low over the river, and the smell of charred timber thick in the air long before we reached the scene. The narrow alleyway of Thanet Court was cordoned off by constables. Smoke still rose from the blackened doorway where the cyclamen rooms had stood. Lestrade met us with an expression of grim satisfaction. "You see, Mr. Holmes, the work of your friend's disciples, no doubt. A fine piece of vengeance. They've blown themselves sky high." Holmes gave a curt nod. "Your report said 3 dead. Who were they?" "One waiter, a patron, identity unknown, and a foreigner. Papers suggest he was Austrian or German. The bodies are barely recognizable." "Show me," Holmes said simply. Inside, the ruin was total. The walls were scorched black, the ceiling caved in, the floor strewn with fragments of glass and metal. The smell of chemicals mingled with burnt silk and oil. Holmes moved like a ghost through the wreckage, crouching, occasionally, to lift a twisted scrap of brass or sift through the ashes. At one point he held up a melted fragment that gleamed faintly blue. "The same composition as Harrow's sphere," he said. "Whoever ignited this intended to erase evidence, not lives. The detonation was controlled, too precise for mere accident." Lestrade grunted. "A madman's signature, if you ask me." Holmes shook his head. "No, Inspector. A chemist's. See how the outer walls remain intact while the interior is gutted? The charge was placed centrally, not randomly. And here, what do you make of this?" He indicated a patch of floor that had escaped the worst of the fire. Upon it, traced in ash, was the faint outline of a flower, a cyclamen crudely drawn by hand. "Some kind of mark?" Lestrade muttered. Holmes studied it for a long moment. "A farewell, I think, or a declaration. Harrow's symbol, left by another hand. The cult of fire continues." We returned to Baker Street late in the afternoon, our clothes smelling of smoke. Holmes threw himself into his chair, his face pale and drawn. "This was no random vengeance, Watson. The second generation always seeks to perfect the first. Harrow's disciples have not merely honored his memory, they mean to complete his work." I felt a chill. But how? His formula was destroyed. Holmes shook his head. "Not entirely. Remember Monckton's films? There were several rolls, and we recovered but one. The others may have been distributed before his death. If so, the knowledge survives, waiting only for hands willing to wield it." He rose suddenly, pacing before the fire. "We must determine who has them. Venn may have kept duplicates, or one of his foreign patrons may have purchased the rest." He seized his violin from its stand, drawing a harsh, discordant note that seemed to match the turmoil of his thoughts. "I fear, Watson, that Harrow's genius has passed into more dangerous company than we have yet imagined. Those who came after him will not waste their time upon symbolic destruction. They will seek spectacle, something to shake the whole of London from its complacency." I watched him with unease. "You think they intend another attack?" "I think," said Holmes, "that Harrow was but the prelude to a larger symphony. The cyclamen rooms were a rehearsal, testing the resonance of the flame. The performance will be public and grand." He stopped pacing and turned abruptly toward me. "You recall the winter exhibition I mentioned, the gathering of the Royal Institute, where London's most curious mind display their marvels. It opens tomorrow night at South Kensington. What better place for his disciples to unveil the new dawn Harrow promised?" The idea struck me like a physical blow. "Then we must alert the authorities at once." Holmes's lips thinned. I shall wire Lestrade to secure the hall, but bureaucracy moves slower than fire. We shall be there ourselves. Bring your revolver, Watson, and pray that we are wrong. For if we are right—" He glanced toward the fog-darkened window. "Then by tomorrow night, London may see its sky glow for reasons far worse than dawn." He turned back to the fire, the flickering light catching the hard angles of his face. In that moment, he looked not triumphant, but burdened, as though he alone saw the shadow stretching ahead. "The hollow-eyed man tried to warn us," he said softly. "We listened too late once, my friend. We must not fail again." And as the last embers of the fire died to ash, I could not help but feel that the game, far from ended, had only just begun anew. The following evening arrived with an oppressive stillness, the kind that seems to hang over London before some great event or disaster. By 7:30, Holmes and I were already on the steps of the Royal Institute, the vast glass-domed hall glowing warmly against the encroaching fog. Carriages drew up in glittering succession. Ladies in silk and gentlemen in black coats crossed the marble threshold, with the eager expectation reserved for spectacles of progress. Yet beneath the laughter and the murmur of anticipation, I felt a tension so palpable that it seemed to vibrate in the air itself. Holmes, ever the observer, scanned the crowd with a gaze that missed nothing. "Observe, Watson," he said softly. "The perfect stage, light, noise, and an audience of the curious. Harrow's disciples could ask for no finer unveiling. Inside, the exhibition sprawled across two great galleries, each brimming with mechanical marvels, electric contrivances, and chemical demonstrations. Along one wall stood a model of an airship, near another a display of electric filaments that bathed the ceiling in ghostly blue light. Holmes moved among the displays like a hound following a faint scent, his eyes darting from faces to instruments, his fingers brushing the rails and tables as though testing for vibration. "Do you expect an explosion tonight?" I whispered. He gave a thin smile. "I expect the possibility of one. Remember, the disciples of Harrow are not vandals. Their destruction must carry meaning. They will strike at the very heart of intellectual vanity, where science applauds itself." He nodded toward the central dais, where a group of engineers was assembling an elaborate apparatus beneath a heavy velvet cloth. "There lies our mystery, if I'm not mistaken." At that moment, a familiar voice hailed us. "Holmes, Dr. Watson?" Inspector Lestrade, incongruously polished in evening dress, elbowed his way through the crowd. "We've guards posted at every entrance and plainclothes men in the hall. If your lunatics show themselves, we'll have them before they strike a match." Holmes inclined his head politely. "Your precautions are admirable, Inspector. Let us hope they are equal to the ingenuity of our adversary." He drifted toward the dais as the Master of Ceremonies announced the next demonstration. The velvet cloth was drawn aside, revealing a magnificent array of glass tubes, copper coils, and mirrored lenses. "Gentlemen," declared the presenter, a tall, silver-haired man with the commanding poise of a lecturer, "I have the honor of introducing the invention of Dr. Cyril Harrow, perfected by his associate and assistant, Mr. Anton Kreutz." Holmes stiffened. "Kreutz," he murmured. "The Austrian name from Lestrade's report. The third body at Thanet Court was never Kreutz's. He has survived, and tonight he presents the flame anew." Kreutz stepped forward, bowing slightly, as a ripple of applause passed through the audience. He was lean, elegant, his expression serene and detached. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "Dr. Harrow's vision was one of transformation, of energy liberated from the fetters of imperfection. Tonight, we demonstrate the principle that will shape the future, pure combustion without residue, the fire that leaves no ash." I saw Holmes's jaw tighten. Exactly as I feared. He means to prove the theory with practice. A hush fell as Kreutz adjusted the brass valves of the machine. The copper coils began to glow faintly, and a pale blue flame flickered within the glass sphere at its core. The compound within, Kreutz explained, is harmless in trace, but once the reaction is complete, a single spark will convert it into a radiant heat capable of transforming air into energy. Holmes's hand closed around my arm. He has recreated the device, magnified, stabilized, and placed at the center of a crowded hall. Good heavens, Holmes, what can we do? Contain it, he said grimly. There is always a weakness. He moved swiftly through the crowd, his eyes fixed upon the base of the machine. I followed close behind, my heart pounding. The sphere pulsed brighter, its blue light deepening toward violet. Kreutz, oblivious or indifferent, spread his arms. We stand at the threshold of a new age, Harrow's age, fire made pure, destruction made divine. Lestrade, Holmes called sharply, cut the power to the generator, now! But even as the inspector shouted orders, I saw Kreutz reach for a lever on the control panel. Holmes sprang forward, seizing his wrist. There was a sudden, deafening crack as a surge of light exploded between the coils. The crowd screamed and surged back. Holmes wrenched the lever free and hurled it aside. Sparks cascaded through the air like shooting stars. The machine shuddered violently, its core blazing like the heart of a furnace. "Watson, the seal at the base!" Holmes shouted. "Break it open! Quickly!" I dropped to my knees beside the apparatus, fumbling with the metal latch that sealed the lower chamber. The heat was unbearable. My fingers burned as I pried it loose with the handle of my revolver. With a hiss of escaping gas, the blue glow faltered, dimmed, then died. A thick plume of smoke coiled upward and vanished into the rafters. For a moment there was only silence, then applause, hesitant, disbelieving, swelling into relief. Holmes stood motionless, his coat scorched, a thin cut bleeding along his cheek. Kreutz slumped in the inspector's grasp, his calm gone, his eyes wild. "You fool!" he spat. "You've killed the future!" Holmes regarded him coldly. "No, Mr. Kreutz, I've preserved it." Lestrade barked an order, and 2 constables dragged the man away. The master of ceremonies, pale and trembling, stammered apologies to the bewildered crowd, who now believed the interruption part of the display. Holmes ignored them, crouching by the disabled machine. He studied its fractured core, then rose slowly. He improved upon Harrow's design, he said quietly. Stabilized the ether compound with crystalline salts. Clever. Too clever. If the seal had failed, the explosion would have carried through the glass dome and set half Kensington ablaze. I could only shake my head. "You've saved them all again, Holmes." He gave a weary smile. "For now. But the doctrine that fueled Harrow and Kreutz is not extinguished so easily. Ideas, like flames, pass from hand to hand. Still," he touched the fractured glass sphere lightly, "even the brightest fire dies without air." Outside, the fog had thinned, and a pale moon gleamed over the quiet streets. As we left the Institute behind, the sound of distant applause still echoed faintly through the night, mingled with the hum of the city, unaware of how near it had come to ruin. Holmes walked in silence for a long while, his gaze turned upward toward the moonlit haze. At last, he said almost to himself, "There are times, Watson, when mankind's reach exceeds its wisdom. Tonight, it was nearly consumed by its own brilliance." And though the danger had passed, I could not shake the image of that blue flame pulsing like a heartbeat, an unnatural light that once kindled might yet find another hand to hold it. The relief that followed the calamity averted at the Institute was brief and brittle, like the silence after a storm when one still hears the wind worrying the eaves. Lestrade, with a tact I had not always credited him, found us a small retiring room off the main gallery where Kreutz could be questioned out of the public eye. The Austrian sat between two constables, his cravat awry, his elegant composure shrunk to a bitter, watchful sullenness. Holmes stood at the mantel, one hand upon it, the other dabbing without apparent interest at the thin cut upon his cheek. "You have improved upon Harrow's work," said he in a tone almost academic. "Stabilize the ether with a crystalline lattice, perhaps Rochelle salts, perhaps something rarer. You are a chemist of real talent, Mr. Kreutz. Talent misapplied." Kreutz's mouth twitched. "The difference between misapplied and celebrated is the signature at the bottom."
Of the page. "Or the number at the bottom of the inquest," Holmes returned. "Who taught you to carve flames into flowers? Harrow? Or the hand behind him, the one that signs himself C?" The prisoner's lids flickered. "Letters are letters." "And squares are squares," Holmes said softly. "D4, F2, the Queen's file safe? You carry a chessman into a lady's house, you light a blue heart under her stare, you sketch 2 squares in a dead man's pocket as if to remind yourself which doors to use. Very pretty. Where is the board, Mr. Kreutz?" "On every London map," the man said with a trace of scorn, "if you can play it." Holmes's eyes brightened with that cold light I have seen when the last piece of a pattern slides into place. He moved from the mantel to the little writing table and drew, from memory, that same 8 by 8 grid we had found upon Monkton. "For the benefit of my medical friend," he said, "the Queen in chess stands upon the D-file. The Queen's file safe, a reassurance to a courier that any rendezvous along streets beginning with that letter are controlled, watched, or otherwise hospitable. D4, down street, 4th house. F2, Fetter Lane, 2nd door, a poor man's map, written for a poor man's mind, but good enough by lamplight." Kreutz's nostrils flared. He suppressed the movement too late. Holmes went on without triumph. "Your blossom burned its own stem last night at Thanet Court. Not accident, erasure. Which of your congregation ordered it?" The Austrian looked him full in the face at last, and the scientist in him, perverse and proud, could not resist one thrust. "You think Harrow was the head. He was a herald. Heads do not preach in cellars. They drink tea in drawing-rooms and nod at premieres. Heads own shops that do not close." He smiled thinly. "If you wish a name, I will give you a letter. C." "Cyril?" I began, but Holmes lifted a finger. "No," he said. "Harrow is caged, and Kreutz would not spend his last vanity upon a dead title. The initial stands apart. Cyclamen, too public. There remains our unobtrusive tradesman, Henry A. Venn, whose livelihood requires duplication, whose bench bears the blue wax, whose ledgers may catalogue pawns like lace." Kreutz's mouth hardened to a line. "Inspector," Holmes said, turning, "your men should presently attend upon Mr. Venn's establishment in New Oxford Street. Quietly. You will find, I think, more glass than books." Lestrade tugged at a cuff and gave a brisk nod. "I'll have them there in 10 minutes. He jerked his head at Kreutz. "And this one?" "Charge him," said Holmes, "or with every count you can make stick, but keep him breathing. Even zealots have rivalries. If the flower has more gardeners, he will not bear to leave them the credit." We stepped back into the cool night, and the moon whitened the museum stone as if it had been scrubbed for a royal
inspection. Holmes refused the cab Lestrade offered and set off at his long, untiring stride. I kept pace, my mind racing. "Down street, Fetter Lane," I said. "Do you suppose there are other squares, other addresses?" "I do. Monkton's diagram was not idle. It was a pocket catechism. D for safe houses, F for furnaces, that is, places suited to ignition or experiment. Others may stand for recipients, Q for Queen Street, K for King William. You perceive how a man with a handful of letters can spread a net across a city. He halted under a lamp and drew the Purcell folio from his coat, the same volume Miss Sterling had guarded like a reliquary. The cipher that yielded us the warning may yield us a root. He angled the page until the faint ultramarine flecks gleamed like midges on the staves. His pencil moved swiftly, lightly, counting bars, translating sharps and naturals to letters, leaps to numbers. "Here," he murmured. "First movement, D4, second, F2, third, D6, fourth, Q3. The hand grows hurried, fearful. Monckton wrote this on the run." "D6? Duke Street, 6th house," said Holmes, "if we are fortunate." "And Q3, Queen Street, third door, and the Queen's file safe." A refuge. He meant to circle and return. He meant to fetch the films he had not yet destroyed, then carry them to a place beyond sea. He failed. We must succeed. Within the hour, we had roused a sleepy sergeant at the corner of Duke Street and Piccadilly, and enlisted with my medical card the reluctant cooperation of a porter and a night watchman whose notions of legality were comforted by the presence of a physician. At the 6th step house, a sober brick frontage with shuttered windows, Holmes's lamp showed, just under the stair, 2 bright pinpricks where someone too conscientious had overpolished the brass tacks that fastened the runner. "Masonic neatness," Holmes said softly, "and the habit of doing the same thing the same way." In 5 minutes the tread was eased and the lid of the cavity lifted. Within lay a clockwork box, its little holes breathing the faintest warmth. "Not tonight," Holmes whispered, and his fingers moved with that surgeon's delicacy which makes a man forget to breathe. The hum diminished, ceased, the odour of ether fled. He lifted out, not film this time, but a shallow tin with a glass within it, and, rolled tight as a seal's ear, a strip of micrography bound with black. He held it to the lamp. The letters fluttered there in negative, measurements, symbols, and the one word that makes a doctor cold, fulminate. "We shall let no second Kreutz inherit this," he said. "Replace the shell, Watson. Leave the house as we found it." Queen Street was harder. The third door belonged to a quiet lodging house. A bleary woman with pins in her hair squinted at us and crossed herself at the sight of 2 men with a lamp at midnight. Holmes's card and a whisper of "Scotland"
"Yard!" transformed terror to indignation, but indignation thawed when the third stair breathed upon her fingers with a warmth no draught could boast. "Saints preserve us!" she said, and fled to her scullery. Here the cavity held what I think spared London 100 widows, 4 spools of film and a neat ledger, Venn's hand as prim as his spectacles. Holmes turned the pages with unholy relish. Customers, dates, sums, and, God bless the common criminal, addresses. Observe, D4, delivered to C, F2, trial, unstable. D6, reserve, to be removed upon signal. And here, a mark against each, a small cyclamen, drawn with a flourish, not Venn's, our letter writer's sign manual. "Then C is no cyclamen," I said. "He is the man who owns it." "Or the man who thinks he does," Holmes answered. Harrow was the flame, Kreutz the lens, Venn the lampstand. C stands in the dark and counts the gas. He shut the book and slipped it into his coat. We must be in New Oxford Street before Lestrade loses his temper among the bric-a-brac. The antiquarian's shop was no longer shuttered, but lit within like a lantern. The door stood open. The bell above it had been tied with a strip of muslin to keep it still. Venn himself sat behind the counter, hands on the wood, palms up, like a communicant. His spectacles were gone. His eyes, naked without them, were small and red-rimmed. "I expected you," he said, with the resignation of a man who has heard a verdict long before it is read. Holmes did not waste courtesy. He laid the ledger on the counter and tapped it with one finger. "The hand is yours," he said. "The flourish is not. Tell me what C stands for, Mr. Venn, and tell me quickly. Every minute I spend listening to you is a minute in which some other stare may learn to breathe." Venn swallowed. His glance flitted to the curtained arch, where, I did not doubt, machines slumbered amid bales of paper. A constable's shadow moved there. Lestrade's profile cut the curtain like a seal. "C," Venn said at last, "is a gentleman whose name you know better than mine. He is a patron of learning, a subscriber to lectures, a chairman where science sits with money. He paid me to copy what he indicated and to keep a register only I could read. I took his coins and told myself that I was no thief, that knowledge belongs to all. I was a fool." "A name," Holmes said. His voice was very quiet. Venn closed his eyes. "Sir Cadogan Vale." I started. The name was one to conjure with in certain circles, and Holmes's face did not change at all. "Of course," he said. "The man who opens doors for other men and never turns a key himself. He chairs committees, he chooses prizes, he praises Harrow's paper and deplores Harrow's explosion. He recommends a clerk to a lady's household. He writes a letter with a flower for seal and leaves it to smaller men to light the fuse."
Venn's voice, when it came, was a broken thing. He said what Kreutz says, that the world must be made clean. He said old houses burn so that new ones might rise with better drains. I made the boxes because I am good with brass. Holmes's hand fell once upon the ledger as a judge's upon a bench. "Inspector," he said, without raising his voice, "you will close this place, guard this man, and send your 2 least foolish constables in plain clothes to Vale House in Portland Place. If Sir Cadogan is at home, they are to keep him so. If he is out, they are to follow him and send word by boy to Baker Street." "And you?" said Lestrade. Holmes turned, the old flame in him renewed, not destructive, but fierce. "I," he said, "am going to set a little trap, one that requires a knight, a pawn, and the Queen's file. Sir Cadogan Vale has moved others upon the board long enough. It is time he took a step himself." The morning that followed was one of those grey London dawns that seem less like a beginning than a hesitant continuation of the night before. A damp mist clung to the panes of Baker Street, blurring the outline of the street lamps beyond. Holmes sat by the hearth, unshaven, silent, his eyes half closed but not resting. The fire before him had burned low, its embers pulsing faintly like thoughts not yet extinguished. Upon the table lay the ledger from Venn's shop, now folded open at its final page, and beside it the sealed envelope that Lestrade's messenger had delivered an hour earlier. I poured a measure of coffee and waited until he spoke. "Sir Cadogan Vale," he said at last, "was arrested at precisely 3 o'clock this morning in his library at Portland Place. Lestrade's men found him awake, dressed, and awaiting them. He offered neither surprise nor resistance. He merely remarked that one should be present when the curtain falls." Holmes gave a faint, humourless smile. "He has the soul of a dramatist, if not its talent." "What has he confessed?" I asked. "Nothing, of course. Men like Vale never confess. They explain." He spoke of vision, of duty, of a fire that must purify what is stagnant. Harrow was his instrument, Kreutz his craftsman, Monckton his conscience. The cyclamen rooms, Venn's shop, the ladies' staircase, all were stages of one performance. He fancied himself the conductor of progress, turning men into tools and ideas into detonators. When I pressed him on his endgame, he said, "To prove that ignorance fears enlightenment more than it fears death." A fine phrase for an epitaph, if lacking moral sense. Holmes rose, pacing slowly before the hearth. Vale's type is the most dangerous, one who mistakes intellect for virtue. The others, Harrow, Kreutz, were fanatics of science. They sought discovery at any cost. Vale was a fanatic of vanity. He saw in their genius a mirror for his own ambition, and when they faltered, he used them as tinder for his
illusion of immortality. I watched him for a while, hearing the weariness beneath his precision. "And yet," I said, "you look as though you take no pleasure in victory." "Victory, Watson," he replied, "is a word for gamesmen. What we have achieved is merely postponement. There will be others who follow the same path, not out of evil, but out of pride. London will always produce its Vale, its Harrow, its Kreutz. The difference lies only in the degree of intelligence, not intention. Still," he gave a slight shrug, "one must do what one can to delay the inevitable." A rap at the door interrupted us. Lestrade entered, still smelling faintly of rain and tobacco, his usually brisk manner subdued. "It's done," he said. "Vale's papers are secured. There's enough in them to keep the Home Office awake for a week. There's talk of making the whole thing disappear. Quietly. Too many prominent names in those ledgers." He looked at Holmes. "You've done London a service tonight, though it'll never know it." Holmes inclined his head slightly. "The world seldom thanks those who spare it embarrassment. It is enough that the city wakes unburned." Lestrade sighed. "Still, there's something odd. When we took him, Vale had this in his hand." He drew from his pocket a small chess piece, a white queen, its base stained with blue wax. He was turning it over and over like a man saying his prayers. "Said only this before we led him away: every game ends with the queen. What do you make of that?" Holmes took the piece and turned it between his fingers. "The queen, the one piece that moves as she pleases, yet exists only to protect the king. Vale saw himself as both master and martyr. How fitting that he chose her as his emblem. The queen may fall, Inspector, but the board remains." When Lestrade had gone, Holmes placed the piece upon the mantel beside the little glass vial we had taken from Harrow's laboratory, the remnant of the blue flame that had nearly devoured the city. For a moment, the two objects caught the faint light of morning, gleaming side by side like symbols of reason and madness intertwined. Holmes sank back into his chair and steepled his fingers. "You see, Watson, the irony is almost perfect. The mind that invents wonders is never content to stop at the useful. It must push toward the forbidden, not from wickedness, but from curiosity. Men like Vale exploit that hunger. They whisper of enlightenment while striking matches in the dark. And we," he gestured toward the fire, "we spend our lives stamping out sparks before they find tinder." "You speak as if the battle were hopeless," I said gently. He smiled faintly, though there was no mirth in it. "Hopeless? No, my dear fellow, endless, which is not quite the same thing." The clock on the mantel struck 8, the sound sharp in the still room. Outside, the fog was beginning to lift, revealing a pallid sun
that struggled through the smoke above the rooftops. Holmes rose and drew the curtains wider, letting in the cold, colourless light. "It is a new day, Watson," he said quietly. "And for the moment, it is a safe one. Let us be grateful for that." He turned then, the faintest glimmer of his old energy returning. "Now, fetch your coat. Mrs. Hudson's patience with my silence has reached its limit, and I believe she mentioned a breakfast of uncommon promise. After all," he added, with that sudden spark of irony that could never quite extinguish itself, "it would be a crime to let good bacon grow cold while the world insists on warming itself with foolish ideas." I laughed in spite of the fatigue that still weighed on me. The sound seemed to lighten him. He reached for his hat, and together we stepped out into the misty street. Behind us, the fire on the hearth gave one last soft crackle before settling into embers. And as we walked toward the pale glimmer of the awakening city, I could not help but think that though Holmes had once more saved London from the flame, it was his own mind, sharp, restless, and forever burning, that would never truly be at rest.